I'm going to thank all of you for joining us today. I just want to tell you that this has been a real struggle for me. I visited Ukraine with the United States Holocaust Museum about 10 years ago. And what's going on right now is of great concern, and it's going to have an impact on Holocaust education, and we will talk about that as well. So we know today that Ukraine is an independent country, it's sovereign, but a fully independent Ukraine emerged only in the late 20th century. And there were long periods of control by Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Ukraine had a brief period of independence between 1918 and 1920 after World War I, but portions of Western Ukraine were ruled by Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia in the period between the two world wars. And after World War II, Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine declared sovereignty on July 16, 1990, and then independence on August 24, 1991. Independence was confirmed by a popular vote within the country on December 1st, 1991. And with the dissolution of the USSR in December of 1991, Ukraine gained its full independence, and it's been there since then. So Ukraine has a complicated history. They experienced that brief independence during World War I after the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Soon after, it was annexed by Poland in the West, and as we said, the Soviet Union in the East. The years between the establishment of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the German invasion in June 1941 brought lots of misery to the people there. A famine, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, caused by economic changes and forced Soviet collectivization of farms, resulted in the deaths of millions of men, women, and children living in Ukraine. It had once been the breadbasket of Europe. On the eve of the German invasion in 1941, Ukraine was home to the largest Jewish population in Europe. The fate of those Jews depended on many factors, including the local occupying authority and whether they were among those who had been evacuated to the Soviet Union ahead of the invading forces. While scholars today are still researching the scale of the Holocaust in Ukraine, they estimate now that at least 1.5 million Jews were killed there, and this was before the opening of the gas chambers. Scholars are still in the process of gathering records and testimony to fully tell the story of what happened in Ukraine during the Holocaust. The current political situation may put a halt to this important work. So let's take a look, and let's look a little bit further back to see why so many Jews lived there and why they were in the western part of Ukraine, which made them vulnerable as the Nazi forces, as the German forces began to move in. Catherine the Great established something that was called the Pale of Settlement in 1791, and this was determined to be a territory where Jews were allowed to live in Russia. This was created under pressure to rid Moscow of Jewish business competition and what they called evil influence on the Russian masses. So the Pale of Settlement included territory of present-day Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. More than 90% of Russia's Jews were forced to live in the very bad conditions of the Pale of Settlement, which made up only 4% of Imperial Russia. Still, during that period, the Jewish population in Russia grew from 1.6 million in 1820 to 5.6 million in 1910. And even within the Pale, Jews were discriminated against. They had to pay double taxes, they were forbidden to lease land, and they had to they couldn't run taverns or receive higher education. In the 1860s, Jews were given some privileges in the Pale of Settlement, but this was reversed in 1882. These new laws, called the May Laws, restricted Jews to the Pale in urban areas, often overcrowded, which offered limited economic opportunities. In addition, thousands of Jews fell victim to pogroms in the 1870s and 80s. Anti-Semitism, pogroms, and boycotts Jews faced in the Pale led to mass immigration to the United States. Over 2 million came from there between 1881 and 1914, and that included my grandparents. Zionism also became popular in the Pale. Only after the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917 was the Pale of Settlement abolished. Nevertheless, many Jews continue to live in that area. The Ukrainian genocide, Holodomor. In 1932 and 33, millions of Ukrainians were killed in the Holodomor, a man-made famine engineered by the Soviet government, mostly by Joseph Stalin. The primary victims were rural farmers and villagers who made up roughly 80% of Ukraine's population. It's estimated that the famine caused the deaths of at least 3.5 million, upwards to 7 million people. Through a study of this, students can come to understand that this is an example of how prejudice and a desire to dominate and control a particular ethnic group can lead to the misuse of power. It can also lead to genocide. By the end of the 1920s, Joseph Stalin consolidated his control over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Feeling threatened by Ukraine's autonomy, Stalin took measures to destroy Ukrainian peasants and the intelligentsia, and to prevent them from seeking independence for Ukraine. He decreed what they called the first 5-year plan, which included collectivizing the farms and agriculture. Collectivization gave the Soviet state control over Ukraine's rich agricultural resources and allowed the state to control the supply of grain for export. And this would become the problem. Grain exports would be used to fund the USSR's transformation into an industrial power. The majority of rural Ukrainians who were independent farmers resisted collectivization. They were forced, however, to surrender their land, their livestock, and farming tools and work on government farms as laborers. Wealthy and successful farmers who opposed collectivization were called kulaks. They were declared enemies of the state, to be eliminated as a class, and the elimination of kulaks was an integral part of collectivization. It served 3 purposes: a warning to those who oppose them, a means to transfer confiscated land to the collective farms, and a means to eliminate the leadership within these Ukrainian communities. Secret police and the militia stripped kulaks not only of land, but their homes and belongings, systematically deporting them into the far regions of the USSR, sometimes executing them. As famine escalated, growing numbers of farmers left their villages in search of food outside their homes. Directives in January of 1933 prevented them from any travel, effectively sealing the borders of Ukraine. Over 1/3 of villages in Ukraine were put on blacklists for failing to meet grain quotas for the USSR. These blacklisted villages were encircled by troops, and residents were blockaded from leaving or receiving supplies. It was essentially a death sentence. To escape death by starvation, people in the villages ate anything that was edible: grass, acorns, even cats and dogs. Contemporary Soviet police archives contain descriptions of the immense suffering and despair of Ukrainian farmers, including instances of lawlessness, theft, lynching, and even cannibalism. While Ukrainians were dying, the Soviet state took 4.27 million tons of grain from Ukraine in 1932. This was enough to feed 12 million people for an entire year. So the people were deliberately kept from the food. Most historians have concluded that the famine was deliberate and linked to Soviet policy to subjugate the Ukrainian people. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of Soviet government archives, researchers have been able to demonstrate that Soviet authorities undertook measures specifically in Ukraine with the knowledge that the result would be the deaths of millions of Ukrainians by starvation. And here you can see one of the memorials to the Holodomor. And you will hear Ukrainians, when they talk about the Holocaust, they're actually talking about the famine from the 1930s. If you want to read further about this, Dr. Timothy Snyder from Yale has written a book called Bloodlands, which talks about all of the events in Ukraine and Russia and Germany during this period from the 1930s through the 1940s. Excellent book. Okay, so in 1939, 1940, we know that World War II started on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. There was a pact between Germany and the Soviet Union to divide up Poland. So you can see here the two separate areas of Poland. The part that was further east was controlled by the Soviet Union. The part further west, closer to Germany, was controlled by the Nazi regime. And here is just a map of the invasion of the Soviet Union, which is really quite extraordinary because there they had a pact. Nevertheless, Hitler made plans to invade the Soviet Union. And you can see the path. You can see what is current day Ukraine, with much of which is in green on this particular map. And you can also see that the farthest point of the Nazi invasion got almost to Moscow. They were literally just miles from Moscow before they were turned back. Now, one of the things that we all know about are the Einsatzgruppen. They were mobile killing squads, and they followed the invading armies from Germany. They followed behind, and their job was to get rid of political opponents and Jews in this particular land. So if we look at the map and we see the demarcation line, we can also see that as they came through, and we're going to talk about Babi Yar as well. Zhytomyr is where my family was from, my father's family. They came through this way, and you can see all of the locations of the major massacres. And we're going to talk about some of them in just a few minutes. So now let's talk about the Holocaust by bullets. The Holocaust in Ukraine represents the first phase of the final solution, during which an estimated 1.5 million Jews were shot to death at close range in ravines and open fields and forests. Based on present-day borders, 1 in every 4 Jewish victims of the Holocaust was murdered in the Ukraine, and these numbers continue to grow. The summer and fall of 1941 are especially significant because they represent a period of critical escalation of mass murder. In a matter of months, mobile Nazi killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, which had begun shooting all adult male Jews during the invasion of the Soviet Union, expanded their goals to include a genocide targeting women, children, and entire Jewish communities. Before the killing centers opened, at Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzish, and Madyanek, more than 1.5 million Jews had already been murdered by the Germans, their Axis allies, and local collaborators, and that's really important, in Ukraine, Belarus, and other Soviet republics. These were the first victims of the Holocaust, the first Jewish victims of the Holocaust. They were not transported by trains to the famous killing sites in Poland with their gas chambers and crematoria. Instead, these victims were taken from their homes, usually by foot, to the outskirts of the cities and towns and villages where they lived, and they were brutally shot face to face or in the back, often in the presence of local residents and neighbors. And I'm going to talk about a personal experience I had with that a little later on. Before World War II, the 1.5 million Jews living in the Soviet Republic of Ukraine constituted the largest Jewish population within the Soviet Union and one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe. Between 1939 and 41, when Stalin occupied Galicia, Western Volhynia, and Northern Bukovina, and Southern Bessarabia, the number of Jews in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic rose to 2.45 million people, increasing the percentage of Jews in those countries from 5 to 6%. This is a very famous photograph. I'm sure many of you have seen this. On the eve of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht and German police developed their policy of mass murder. Just days before the invasion, Nazi leadership issued a memorandum called Guidelines for the Conduct of Troops of Russia. It explicitly connected the threat of communism to the Jewish race, reinforcing Nazi propaganda which alleged that communism was a Jewish plot designed at the expense of the Germans. More importantly, it established a policy of terror that approved the mass killing of any group seen as a potential threat. 4 commandos of Einsatzgruppen, security police, and security service followed the Wehrmacht's armies in northern and central Ukraine. Their main focus was the murder of Soviet political functionaries and other political enemies. During the first weeks of the invasion, as German troops overran territory in Ukraine, large numbers of Jewish men were rounded up in cities and towns. In an order dated July 11, 1941, this is shortly after the invasion, a commander of a police regiment in Belarus recommended that Jews be shot on the outskirts of towns and villages to shield local residents from the sights and sounds of mass murder in order to, quote, erase the impressions of the day. The order also called for evenings of camaraderie to follow every mass killing event, which typically included, for the Einsatzgruppen, meals prepared by local residents, music, and alcohol. Kamenets-Podilsky. The massacre in the Ukrainian town was one of the first sites of mass murder during the Holocaust by bullets. Of the 40,000 residents, Jews made up about a third of the town's population. When German and Hungarian troops captured the town in early July, thousands of Jews fled east. Shortly after the region was captured, government officials in Budapest expelled all Jews from Carpatho Ukraine, a region that contained not only large Jewish communities, but also thousands of Jewish refugees from Germany and Poland. By the end of July, more than 10,000 Jews had arrived in Kamenets-Podilsky, the nearest town across the Hungarian border. The influx of thousands of people put a strain on housing and the food supply. On August 25, 1941, during a meeting between the High Command of the Army and the Reich Ministry, an ominous solution was presented, promising to liquidate these Jews before September 1st, 1941. And look at them marching through the towns. You can imagine that all of the people living there saw what was going on. The next day, on August 26th, the action against the Jews began. The first day, Hungarian troops and police units led 4,200 men, women, and children to an execution site where they were shot. And according to eyewitnesses, victims had to hand over their valuables, undress, climb into the pit, lie on the ground on top of each new layer of fresh corpses, and then they were shot in the back of the head. The next day, Police Battalion 320 shot an additional 11,000 Jews. This action included the murder of Jews from Carpatho, Ukraine, but also 2/3 of the local Jewish population. When the shooting stopped, it was reported that 23,600 Jewish people, including 14,000 from Carpatho, Ukraine, had been killed. This mass killing represents the largest massacre of Jews in Ukraine during the summer of 1941. It continued throughout the fall of 41 as tens of thousands of other men, women, and children were shot to death. Now we're going to talk about Babi Yar, and this is the one that I think most of you are familiar with. Perhaps the most well-known mass shooting in Ukraine took place at Babi Yar, the site of one of the largest mass shootings of Jews in German-occupied Europe. On September 19th, 1941, German forces entered the city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, an estimated 160,000 Jews resided in Kiev, which represented close to 20% of the city's population. Once the invasion was underway, about 100,000 Jews fled or were conscripted into the Russian army. Those that remained in the city mostly included women, children, and the elderly. The immediate pretext for the massacre was a series of explosions in the capital that were caused by Soviet mines, which had been timed to explode after the Germans entered the city. Those explosions destroyed German headquarters and buildings along the main streets. The blasts also killed a large number of German soldiers and officials. In Kiev, Nazi officials used this sabotage as a pretext to murder the Jews who still remained. The Wehrmacht worked closely with the SS and police forces in Kiev, and on September 29th through 30th, under the guidance of the Einsatzgruppen, the German police units and their auxiliaries rounded up the Jewish population in Kiev, which is the city. Imagine them walking through there, and transported them to a ravine called Babi Yar, located just outside the city. The victims were shot in small groups, and Babi Yar, by the way, was a park. A report summarizing the event states that on September 29th and 30th, they executed 33,771 Jewish people. Just days after the murder of Kiev's Jews, Hitler issued an order, quote, "In a country that, owing to its vastness and fertility, could feed the whole world, poverty rules to such an extent that we Germans could not imagine. This is a result of a nearly 25-year Jewish rule that, as Bolshevism, is basically similar to the general form of capitalism. The bearers of this system in both cases are the same, Jews and only Jews." And this is from my trip. This is a memorial at Babi Yar, and the gentleman who is outlined in red was a child survivor of Babi Yar. He was actually being watched by his nanny, who brought him along with the other Jews to Babi Yar. And when she realized what was going on, she quickly pulled him away, was able to get him out. He ended up in an orphanage, but he did survive. The survivor did speak to us and tell us about his experiences. And then we were really fortunate. There was a member of the Boston Symphony Orchestra who was with us. This gentleman is now the head of the Terezin music group that studies Holocaust music. And you will see him again. He played some extraordinary music at many of these places. There were also smaller killing sites, okay? Hundreds of smaller mass shootings in towns and villages throughout Ukraine, with the number of victims each time ranging from 100 to 3,000. After the war, 495 sites were identified, but Yahad and Unum, which is Father Desbois' organization, puts the number at 916 and growing. His extraordinary work, the work of Father Desbois, who interviewed hundreds of witnesses throughout Ukraine, reveals a general pattern of how these smaller mass shootings unfolded. Some characteristics were similar, and one of his books called In Broad Daylight tells us about that particular experience. Quote, "There were people of every age, children, old people. They'd been told to gather because they were going to be taken to work somewhere, and that they should bring food and their children because there would be nurseries in which they would be looked after. The Jews had an armband. Then they were told to undress, and they were thrown into the pits. At the end of the day, I went to look. The earth was moving, since many had not died right away." Local police and German officials often requisition non-Jewish civilians to dig the pits, fill in the mass graves, collect Jewish clothing, sort through valuables, take out gold teeth, or transport Jews to pits in their carts. The requisitioned were mostly young men, women, children, or adolescents who were not only present at the event, but in some ways had been forced to participate depending upon the task that they were assigned. And now I just want to show you some of the sites that we saw on this trip. So this is the city of Kiev, which has been in the news. And the gentleman holding the flag is what they call a progressive rabbi. He's been quoted in a number of articles recently about the problems going on there. This is the home of the American ambassador. At the time, John Teft was the ambassador. We got to visit in his home. And here you can see again that Mr. Ludwig, played his violin for us. I took this picture because far in the distance, which we really can't identify here, but is Chernobyl. This is taken from Kiev. Okay, and then we also went to visit the burial place of the Baal Shem Tov. which is also in Ukraine. There is a very large group of ultra-Orthodox young men who are studying in this area. And it's going to be, and they're from all over the world. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens if and when Ukraine is entered by the Russian troops. And this is the interior. This is his tomb. These are some more mass graves. They are everywhere, everywhere. And mass grave here, you can see right on the outskirts. We also went to Lvov or Lviv, again, mass graves, memorials. For those of you who read Daniel Mendelssohn's book, The Lost, our guide was the guide for Daniel Mendelssohn. It was Alex who took us through this area. And for me, it was particularly poignant as some cattle cars came through that area. So I took a picture of that as well. Okay, and now we're looking at German expansion in the east. I have Kiev marked, and I have Perpetrators, which you'll see in blue in the lower left. And I just want to tell you about this because Wendy Lauer, who is a Holocaust scholar, one of the books that she published was The Diary of Samuel Goldfarb, who told his story about being in Perpetrators in Galicia, and about his experiences there. And so we were able to go there. This is what it looks like. And here we were with a gentleman who was a barber, and he was also a witness to what happened. You can see Wendy Lauer standing next to him. You can also see her on the right. And he talked about the Jews being marched through the city into a space not that far away where they were murdered. This is a memorial. There was a priest in the church who did save some of the Jews from the area. So there's a memorial for him. And then here we are in the woods at the mass grave site. And here's a memorial. Many of the original memorials were put up by the Soviet Union, and they talk about Soviet citizens being murdered. They don't mention Jews at all. So there are some newer memorials. And you can see that although it's a city, some of it is still pretty primitive. And then here's Father Desbois, who joined us on the trip. We had dinner in a very nice restaurant in this building up on top, beautiful views. And I remember as we were sitting there, I had met Father Desbois a number of years ago. He came over to me and asked me to come with him to the windows. And he said he could point in any direction and show me where there were mass graves. This was also a place that was used to incarcerate people and torture them. And here he is speaking to our group. It was a Shabbat dinner, actually. And then the next morning, he wanted to take us to Rava Ruska. Rava Ruska is where his grandfather had been imprisoned as a prisoner of war, a French prisoner of war, which is what actually motivated him to find out what was going on in these places. He knew I was a teacher, and he said to me, I think it would be good for you to ride in the car with the witnesses. And so I got in the car with people, none of whom spoke English. And we started driving through the countryside. And what I learned was that all of the people who we stopped, every one of them of a certain age, they had all seen what happened. Every one of them had been involved. If you were in your 80s, you were there. If you had lived in this town your whole life. It was extraordinary to me, just extraordinary. Everybody knew, everybody had seen it. These were their neighbors. And so we went to the burial site, and Father Desbois interviewed some of these witnesses. And of course, it was very complicated because the translator, the Ukrainian translator, didn't speak English, she only spoke French. So Father Desbois asked the question in French. She asked it in Ukrainian. They answered in Ukrainian. Then she gave the answers in French to Father Desbois, and then he gave them to us in English. So we heard their stories about what they had seen, and you can see the looks on their faces. And in this particular case, the woman on the left, Father Desbois pointed at the space where the mass grave was, and he told us not to get in the space because this particular woman could envision everything as long as she could see the space. So we all stayed behind, and she told us the story of what she had seen there, her neighbors, friends, their children, elderly, all being brought there to be shot. So I want to close by talking about Wendy Lauer's new book, and it's about a photograph that she found in Russian archives that had not been available up until the fall of the Soviet Union. And here you can see people being shot into a pit. So, and this was in Mariupol, Ukraine. This was 1941. And what she does is she deconstructs the photograph, and she learns a whole bunch of things about it. Okay. So here we see a woman and a child, okay, and they are falling into a pit, but there are other things we need to look at. So first of all, she enlarges the photograph, and she's able to identify through other records and research that she does, she's able to identify the perpetrators. And they are not only German soldiers or Einsatzgruppen, but they are also local customs officials who were perpetrators in this photograph. She also looks at this part of the photo, and you can see in the foreground a pair of shoes that are empty. Somebody else had been shot before this. We also see the mother. She is holding the little boy's hand. Her face is obscured because of the shooting. And what Wendy Lauer also noted was that she was actually holding a younger child in her lap at the same time. So it wasn't just one child, it was two. And so what I'd like to do is just talk about the fact that she was able to identify the perpetrators. She was not able to identify the victims. What we know is that following the invasion of the Soviet Union by the German military, special forces, the Einsatzgruppen, arrived with orders to kill civilians perceived to be enemies of Nazi Germany. Many Jews in Ukraine were shot to death close to where they lived, not deported to distant camps. Their executioners were German, but also Ukrainian, Russian, as well as other local collaborators. After the war, Soviet authorities tended to minimize the uniquely Jewish tragedy that occurred during the occupation. Soviet archives were not available to scholars to write the history of the Holocaust in the East. Following Ukraine's declaration of independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, scholars have begun piecing together a more complete history of the Holocaust in Ukraine. The fates of Ukrainians, both Jewish and non-Jewish, during this period still needs to be researched. Historian Wendy Lauer observed, writing the history of the Holocaust in Ukraine has been, and probably will continue to be, a very complicated, politically perilous endeavor. And so I show you a map right now of the borders of Ukraine, the current borders of Ukraine. We know that all of this is changing, and we don't know what kind of impact this is going to have on whatever records are available, and also on the sites that need to continue to be examined by our scholars. So I'll end with that, and thank you.